I'll just introduce Alf Baird, who hopefully you can all see. Alf was a professor of maritime. I'm going to read this out now. He's a professor of maritime business, and he was director of the Maritime Research Group at Napier University in Edinburgh until he retired. And you've been retired now for a few years, I think, have you not, Alf?
2016, yeah.
2016, right. So you've been busier now than you've ever been. He's a world-renowned speaker at many conferences on maritime affairs, and he's written hundreds of articles. He really knows what he's talking about, and he's well worth listening to. So I will hand you over to Alf now. And if you want to share your screen, then we'll set things going.
Right. Okay. Is that coming up, Mike?
Yes, it is.
You can see the palm trees in Orkney.
Yes.
Right, I'll just start off then. I've done a wee contents slide here, which you can see hopefully showing what I hope to briefly cover tonight is some container shipping trends, some idea what a Scapa Flow container terminal would look like, what are the advantages of Scapa Flow, what kind of container services could be attracted to Scapa Flow, some aspects relating to policy, and that's European policy as well as UK policy and sustainability. And I have a few slides just tracking container ship movements through the Pentland Firth, and then some conclusions after that. So some trends. The key trend in container shipping ever since it was introduced in the 60s on intercontinental trades is really dramatic growth, phenomenal growth rates. And you can see here a chart showing from 1990 to 2010, going from 100 million, this is a port container traffic globally, so 100 million containers in 1990 to about 600 million by 2010. Well, that's the growth forecasts for global container port traffic, growing up to 1 trillion containers by today, although it's slightly less than that with COVID. The effect has reduced it slightly, but my understanding is the growth last year was still phenomenal. And then if we look at the regional changes, you can see here the European volumes, port volumes in particular, moving up in the last 5 years from 130 million containers to 160 million. That means that an extra 30 million container capacity has to be provided. And the basic point here is that we actually need a lot more container port capacity. Who provides this port capacity globally? Well, port authorities are mostly publicly owned and they provide the infrastructure, but by and large, the container terminals around the world are operated by what we call global terminal operators, or GTOs. And this is a group of about a dozen or so big companies that operate anything up to 50, 60, 70 container terminals around the world each, including, as you can see here, Port of Singapore Authority, PSA, Hutchison Port of Hong Kong, DP World of Dubai, AP Moller of Copenhagen, and several other Chinese operators and so on. So this is what we see. This is how the container port industry operates, mainly through GTOs, who are in some cases, in many cases, in fact, linked to the container lines. And here we see the global container lines. They operate within 4 or 5 major global alliances. But essentially what this tells us is that there's over 6,000 ships operational in container shipping, able to lift over 24 million containers now and some 300 million tons of cargo. And the biggest container lines, as you can see here, Maersk, Mediterranean Shipping Company, COSCO, some of them operate in excess of 500, even 600 ships. So these big container lines operate massive armadas of ships on all the major world routes. The 3 major routes are the Trans-Pacific, Transatlantic, and Europe Far East, and then what we call the North-South trades, South America, Africa, and Asia and Australia. Another phenomenal change in shipping, apart from just the growth in volumes, the growth in container trade, the growth in the number of container ports and the size, is also the size of ship. So we see the ships have grown from about 1,000 container capacity back in the 60s and 70s up to today's capacity of 24,000 containers. So a massive increase in ship size. Although on certain trades, there's an average ship size is lower than this. Mostly the very biggest ships are operating on the Europe-Asia trade, slightly smaller sizes on Trans-Pacific, and slightly smaller again on transatlantic services. And here we see the largest ship in the world at the moment, the Ever Ace, 24,000 20-foot equivalent containers, TEUs. So that's 12,000 Tesco truck equivalents. At the same time as the bigger ships have increased in size, we've also seen an increase in size of feeder ships. This is a relatively small ship that passes by Orkney pretty much every week from Iceland to the continent and the UK. I should say that back in the 1970s, I worked for a company in Leith who was agent for Eimskip at the time, and they've moved a long way into being one of the biggest European container lines, the Icelandic operator, for feeder services as well. So I just want to talk briefly about hub and spoke systems, where the big vessels meet the smaller vessels, and the opportunity that presents for what we call offshore container hubs. Transshipment, which is the movement of containers from one ship to another in a port, is something that we know pretty well in Scapa Flow for oil transport, ship-to-ship oil transfer, where the cargo doesn't really need access by land as such. It's just going from one vessel to another. But transshipment is one of the fastest growing segments in container shipping, has been for several decades, partly because as ships get bigger, the number of ports that they call tends to reduce. So that means the incidence of transshipment rises. So we see a lot more transfers from bigger vessels to smaller vessels, and also between bigger vessels and what we call relay services. And you can see here this graph for one particular port showing a shift from the red, which is direct shipments, becoming less than transshipment. So some ports are pretty much entirely now devoted to transshipment between ships, traffic between ships, rather than moving cargo by road and rail out of the port. This is another chart just showing the same kind of illustration, where transshipment is moving cargo from bigger vessels to smaller vessels and vice versa, but also using what we call relaying and interlining services, where big vessels connect with other big vessels and transfer boxes between them. And this has given rise to the development globally of quite a number of container transshipment terminals that pretty much all they do is handle transshipment. Here's one in the Bahamas where 98% of the cargo is just moved in and out of the port by sea. Another point here that we should maybe mention is the massive increase in global trade, with container ports increasingly congested, has led to, and the lack of port capacity has vastly reduced reliability. And this chart shows for the top container lines, reliability worsening quite severely. As ports get more and more congested, ships are lying outside the ports with not enough space to get a key slot and to discharge and load the ship again. So the ships are queuing up in many ports, which is not a good thing due to a lack of capacity. So just to briefly go through the Scapa Flow container terminal concept, we can see that, well, we know that many of the offshore container hubs globally are former naval bases. They have a strategic location between seas and ocean, between seas and strategic canals. So quite often these ports are located at intersections that are on the main navigation routes as well, which are strategically important. And another virtue is generally they benefit from natural deep water. Unlike many of the city ports, for example, in the North Sea Basin, all the city ports have artificial dredged channels, which have to be maintained at enormous cost, usually into hundreds of millions of dollars a year, to maintain river ports in, say, Hamburg, Rotterdam, Antwerp, and so on, and also Felixstowe to some extent, and London, the Thames too. Just to briefly look at one of the interesting aerial photographs that the Luftwaffe took of Lyness, as you can see there, just below you. So this was the project really to develop a container port on the top of the Lyness former naval base, which was created during prior to the Second War, and has a large area of flat land close to and an existing quay in not in sufficient depth of water quite, but a large area of land, which is essentially what the container port requires. So the consultants that did work for the council on this included Mott MacDonald's, and they came up with this container terminal project, which I have to say was also advised by the port engineer that I met with, who was with the Valencia and Barcelona, a chap called Rafael, who had developed similar container terminals in the Mediterranean. And he came up with this kind of proposal as well, which the Harbours Department then studied and showed that, yeah, a natural deep water channel could be developed through that between Fara and Hoy, where vessels could come around through Scapa Flow and go through and back out again after working on the quay at Lyness. There's some modifications required here for the channel depth just to be increased slightly, but it's over a relatively short period, a short distance rather, from Scapa Flow. The natural depths there are exactly what's required for the mega ships, or even large transatlantic size container ships would have little difficulty doing this in Scapa Flow. So one of the virtues really is the natural deep water of the location and the existing navigation channels which can be used. Another benefit of Orkney, of course, being the ability to handle the largest ships in the world and the experience of the pilots, the tugs, and the Port Authority vessel traffic services as well are already in existence. So this is already a port and anchorage able to handle the biggest ships in the world. A container terminal would just provide an additional function to Scapa Flow. So that's the one other elevation of the port that was proposed for Lyness, and I'll go into a little bit detail later on about what actually happened to that concept. But you can see there the idea that it gives some protection by Hoy is giving some protection to the berth and for the gantries and the container terminal, and that's basically what it would look like in what they called the first phase. A 550-meter quay, 5 container cranes, able to handle 1 or 2 large vessels simultaneously, or 1 large vessel plus feeder vessels. As with most container terminals, once they develop, they then tend to get a bit hungry for expansion and more land. And the idea for expansion of Scapa Flow container terminal would take this form, with a bit more reclamation either side of Lyness, whichever is preferred, to expand the quay line, the quay front into phase 2, and then perhaps a phase 3. So initial phase would be able to handle, in current productivity levels, about 1 million containers a year. And perhaps eventually the terminal having a capacity towards 3 million containers, which is relatively modest for a container port nowadays, given that the biggest hub in the world perhaps is Singapore, handling more than 35 million containers. So this is a relatively modest container terminal. But having said that, 1 million containers would virtually double Scotland's trade in terms of value, which is another feature. So what are the advantages of Scapa Flow? Well, the problem at the moment for transshipment in Northern Europe is the existing hubs are actually quite a distance from the ocean. And you can see the position of this map showing the distance of the Le Havre Hamburg range ports are quite far away from the Atlantic Ocean, involving a long transit for large vessels in and out, whereas Scapa Flow is positioned, especially for transatlantic trade, closer to North America and the Americas, and also closer to the transshipment markets. And that the three main transshipment markets are modeled in this in studies that I was involved in were the UK, Ireland, West Nordic Atlantic markets, the Baltic, Scandinavia transshipment markets, and also to some extent, to a lesser extent anyway, West France and Iberia transshipment markets. These are the three transshipment markets where containers are currently transferred from large vessels in the Le Havre-Hamburg range. So what we find is the modeling for transshipment ports basically starts with what is the deviation time and distance for the big vessels coming in. And using the Pentland Firth channel, the deviation in and out, it was estimated to be 53 nautical miles for transatlantic services. And you can see then that's a vastly shorter deviation time for a large vessel compared to going into any of the other ports on the continent. Which range from anywhere about 500 miles up to over 1,000 miles. And that involves quite a lot of extra steaming time. These are costs dating from 2008, and you could probably at least double them to today's level. But what it basically shows is the deviation cost in the terms of ship time for a big vessel coming into Scapa Flow is very, very small compared to per container rather, going than any big ship going to the continent. You can see here that for the whole continental range, the cost per container is vastly superior. So for the cost of the mainline ship, the big ship coming in from say North America, South America, Canada, or certain other trades as well, the deviation time at Scapa Flow is much less. So the cost of ship time is much less. But what we have to factor in here is the average feeder ship distance and cost as well, and add it to the overall cost. So these are the modeled feeder ports that were considered. We basically got 25 major feeder ports around Northern Europe, covering these three areas: UK, Nordic, Atlantic areas, Baltic, Scandinavia, and West France, Iberia. So we split the analysis into three areas here. What you can see is this is the deviation cost per container, including feeder. And you can see here on the Scapa Flow side, this is back in 2008 as well. The cost of transshipping via Scapa Flow was about half what it is for these other ports, or even less than half on average compared to other hub ports. So there's a massive saving there potentially for containers coming via Scapa Flow. And that's for UK, Nordic, Atlantic markets, Ireland, and so on. For the Baltic, Scandinavia, again, Scapa Flow is slightly different in terms of slightly longer feeder distance for some ports, again, some ports such as Hamburg, which is very close to the Baltic, but a much reduced deviation time for the big vessel. So overall, Scapa Flow is very competitive for the Baltic markets as well, and avoids the Kiel Canal expense, which is a considerable time and cost. And even for West France Iberian markets, Scapa Flow would be competitive with almost all North Sea ports further in from the English Channel than Southampton. So for all these three markets, Scapa Flow is definitely competitive in that sense, just by looking at the mainline ship deviation cost and the average feeder ship distance cost. So these were the typical reductions in cost. Bear in mind that if you are saving, at the time it's about $100 per container back in 28, 29, that would now be well over $200, that saving. And if the port was handling 1 million containers a year, you can work that out per TEU. That's over $200 million saving a year to the container shipping lines. And that's really the main attraction, although there are some other benefits here. So what container services could be attracted to Scapa Flow? Well, most of them are transatlantic, US East Coast, and there's US East Coast, Canada, US Gulf, the Caribbean, and West Coast South America as well, West Coast North America. And there are also transatlantic services going through Panama to Asia, to Australasia, South Pacific, and so on. So there's a whole range of services could be attracted. And they could also link into existing services going via the North Continent, vessels either coming into the North Continent via the Pentland Firth or via the Channel and going out the other way. So there's a whole range of different options. Also, there's Asia, Europe, US coast, what we call pendulum services. So ships running from Asia through the Mediterranean to Europe, Northern Europe, and then heading on to the US East Coast could be routed this way, and some of them are. We also have what's known as round the world services. That's some carriers have operated fleets of ships that go round the world in one direction or both directions. So like the Phileas Fogg, 80 days around the world, usually requiring 11 or 12 ships in each direction, because the actual time is about 80 odd days, and these services are all run on a weekly schedule. So what are the transshipment or intra-European connections? And here, this map here shows the different options that could be employed, which I'll go into some detail. So we looked at quite a range of different companies and spoke to most of the shipping lines about this within the Port Authority in Scapa. And this is just one of the services that comes via the Pentland Firth Maersk's Montreal service every week. And building in a port call at Scapa Flow actually reduces the amount of distance currently incurred by the service. There's other services here: China shipping to New York, Boston, Atlantic Container Lines services that also go to Gothenburg and come through the Pentland Firth quite often already. Hapag-Lloyd services to the US Gulf Coast. Other services, Mediterranean Shipping Company, China Shipping, other services to the Caribbean hubs. Quite a few services go to the Caribbean hubs. This one, Caucedo in the Dominican Republic, transships cargo for the Caribbean, Central America. And then the Evergreen Line, a few other companies. This one, Hamburg Sud Trident, going to Philadelphia and then on through the Panama Canal to Australasia. So quite a number of liner services. And then what about the feeder connections? And here, what the deep sea lines tend to do is, if the feeder services aren't operating, they introduce their own feeder services. So this would be a typical feeder run from Scapa Flow to the UK West Coast and Ireland, UK East Coast, and then other feeder services to the Baltic, Scandinavia. I should also mention that the Icelandic container operators Samskip and Einskip are passing by Scapa Flow every day with large feeder type container ships going to North Continent and also to the UK and into the Baltic. And the deviation time for these companies would be 0 as well. So Scapa Flow would provide them a good opportunity to move containers around any way required. I should mention also that container transshipment hubs, a large part of the business, perhaps more than a third of the volume, is moving empty containers around from and to areas of demand and supply. All the global trades are imbalanced, which means that a large part of the role of the container port is moving empty containers around. And a strategically located container transshipment port provides a great opportunity to do that. So there's also the possibility, maybe in a lesser scale, to use rail services from the north of Scotland down into the UK. Another big part of the business in container transshipment is mainline to mainline ship operations. And this could be, for example, vessels coming from, say, Germany going to the US East Coast could transfer containers at Scapa Flow to another vessel going from, say, the Baltic to Mexico. So there's a whole range of different options here. There's also options to transfer containers between ships coming inbound. So a ship coming in from, say, the Caribbean with, for example, bananas and going on to Germany or the Benelux countries could transfer containers onto a larger vessel that's going to Poland. And these are options that could be could be exploited and would be exploited at any offshore hub. Another potential is what's got a lot of publicity in recent weeks and months is the idea of free zones. Pretty much all new container ports have free trade zones. And this is an important add-on to create more volume locally for the port. And one of the big areas that could be dealt with at Scapa Flow is probably seafood. And studies were done in the European projects we were involved in promoting Scapa Flow Container Terminal. There was additional projects looking at logistics of seafood across the North Atlantic area from Greenland, Iceland, Faroe, Russia, Norway, Shetland, Orkney, and Scotland. And this would be a great centre to do a lot of the work related to logistics on seafood transportation globally from the North Atlantic, and have Scapa Flow as a logistics centre for that. Bear in mind that one of the biggest barriers to transport is getting the 40 foot or the big reefer containers, the refrigerated containers, and getting access to them. And the container hub would ease that problem considerably. So just to briefly go through some other aspects here on policy and sustainability, I should mention that Scapa Flow, the Harbours Department and Council managed to get Scapa Flow Container Port designated as part of the Scotland's National Transport Strategy back in 28-29. That's lapsed since then, but it was highlighted as a big part of Scotland's transport development possibilities, and one of the major, if not the major, port development in Scotland that should be taken forward. The European projects I was participating in with Highlands Enterprise and also Orkney Council and Harbours Department highlighted Scapa Flow as having a significant role within European transport policy as a part of the Motorways of the Sea network to provide a sustainable transport solution to some of the problems experienced at the traditional North Sea basin ports, which are naturally shallow and very badly congested. So another part of this project was to look at the emissions, and we used a new modelling set up by the Swedish Environmental Research Institute to look at to estimate what the benefits in terms of sulfur and carbon emissions would be for container transshipment via Orkney, and this led to quite interesting results. So the modelling took account of the bigger vessels and also the feeder distances, and it was able to give some idea of the reduction in fuel consumption. So here you can see the reduction in fuel consumption for ships, feeder and mainline vessels for the UK Nordic Atlantic markets, and you can see a vast reduction in fuel consumption, kilos per container slot, under 50 for Scapa Flow compared to an average of 150. So you're talking about a two-thirds reduction in fuel consumption and emissions by using Scapa Flow for feeder transshipment for these markets. For the Baltic Scandinavia, a similar kind of benefit where you're talking about less than half the emissions for Scapa Flow for containers routed that way. And also for the Iberian transshipment markets, a very competitive solution as well. So overall, in terms of cost and environmental benefits for European transport, Scapa Flow has could have potentially a major contribution to make overall. And these are the results for the emissions, sulfur dioxide and CO2 for feeder operations and mainline operations for UK Nordic Atlantic transshipment markets. Again, a big reduction, two-thirds reduction rather, and also for Baltic Scandinavia, at least a 50% reduction on emissions for using Scapa Flow as transshipment. And also a slightly lesser reduction, but still a big reduction for any other feeder market. So basically for all feeder markets in Northern Europe, Scapa Flow has a competitive position in terms of reducing transport costs and emissions. Just very quickly, I'll go through some of the services that were tracked. Some of these ships going from, you can see Scapa Flow in the top right-hand corner of this chart, and then the red dots shows you the positions of vessels being tracked through onto the North American continent. and vice versa. This one as well, going to North American East Coast. Again, the same here. And I think I've got a couple of charts here also showing the feeder routes. Yeah, and there's another chart just showing the overall tracking of the vessels. Yeah, this is one of the Icelandic vessels coming down every day. There's quite a big fleet serving Iceland, and the Icelandic carriers were very interested in development of a Scapa Flow project, not least to tap into the global seafood market. They're currently doing most of their transshipment via Rotterdam, which involves quite an additional extra steaming. And that's another Icelandic vessel there. And even the Greenlandic services of Royal Arctic Line going to Denmark, they're passing through Scapa Flow mostly every week as well, and could potentially work in as a feeder operation. So there's quite a lot of feeder operations, and also the Russians. I didn't really want to mention the Russians today, but quite a few Russian vessels coming down from Murmansk and Arkhangelsk into the UK, Ireland continent, and can easily come via Scapa Flow, and a few other operators. And that's just finished showing the simulation of the initial phase, 550 meters of quay, 5 gantry cranes, 1 million container capacity. So what can we say about this? And just before we get to questions, I thought I'd put some conclusions together here. First of all, the offshore container transshipment hub fits global trends. There are many of these offshore hubs on islands around the world. In fact, one of the companies that wanted to do this is a company that did exactly the same in Malta. And they were quick to point out that Malta has the same land mass as Hoy, but different population. But Malta Freeport handles, I think, about 3 million containers a year. But there's many other similar hubs around the world. Of course, the biggest being Singapore, Colombo, Dubai, Salalah, but smaller hubs in the Caribbean, such as Freeport, Bahamas, Caucedo, Trinidad, so on. We know that through the modeling that transshipment can save shipping lines a great deal of money, and also it helps reduce port congestion costs and delays. And at the moment, port congestion is costing the shipping lines an enormous amount of money, and global industry. Many ports are full of ships waiting queued up, and the shipping lines, the charter rates have grown enormously because the shipping companies need extra tonnage just to store containers, because they can't get spaces in port. So there's more capacity needed, and we know that within the next few years, in the recent years, that there's been a need in Europe for an extra 30 million containers capacity in port. And we also know within the next up until 2050, global container traffic will double again. So it won't just be 1 trillion containers a year, it'll be 2 trillion. So somewhere along the line, more port capacity is provided. And pretty much every country in the world, apart from Scotland, it seems, are planning more container port capacity. So this project, even if it was to happen in the next 5 to 10 years, would add just a small amount to that, but still an important option for container lines. The benefit of Scapa Flow is that it has natural deep water and a massive anchorage for large vessels, and a massive safe anchorage, deep water. These are big virtues that most artificial seaports, obviously, by the term artificial, city ports don't have. We also have, in the context of Lyness, an existing brownfield site. It's possible to have a very sustainable green seaport in the context of this port could be entirely electric, using sustainable energy sources to power the entire port. And these vessels will increasingly themselves be zero emission, and certainly zero emission when they berth, because they would have to use existing shoreside power. But increasingly, the container lines are moving towards very low emission ammonia and methanol, and that will happen that is happening now. So that's another positive attribute here. The way that container ports are generally developed globally, it's slightly different to the UK model. of privatization. But the global port model is for a national government or transport body to advertise a concession for a port lease. So a company advertise a concession for a company to take on a long-term lease of a new port, and then once the lease is agreed, the public authorities can then perhaps put in place part of the basic infrastructure, which might consist of the quay and some backup land, and then the private operator taking the 30-year lease would repay the capital cost of that and also be responsible for putting in place all the cranes, equipment, IT systems, training and so on, and then operate the facility for the 30-year period, repaying any capital costs. So the amount of risk involved for a port authority is actually can be minimized to a great extent through a normal port concession model. But this requires political leadership and commitment, and without that, of course, nothing happens. And I have to say that on the Scapa Flow Container Port project, we were very close to well, an operator had come forward with a business proposal and a proposal to take a long-term concession over the site for a 30-year project, and was willing to do that. But the government at the time refused to support the European funding proposal, actually, that I had prepared for the Director of Harbours, and we were going to submit that to the European Commission for funding from the Trans-European Networks Programme. Because that was on the basis of emission savings as well as cost savings and efficiency improvements that Scapa Flow would deliver. But the UK government refused to support that. And I don't know if you know, instead, we actually did get funding for a container terminal manager to come and develop this site, and a container terminal manager was found as a former Maersk Sea Land container terminal manager from the Middle East, and he was, although he was a Scotsman, but he had been working in the Middle East to set up container ports, transshipment ports, and he had the required skills. But the council, in their wisdom, decided to use that money to recruit somebody on renewables, and then develop Lyness for the Pelamis wave machine, which, as many of you will know, ended not in the best way, which, as far as I remember, cost about £50 million, but the company went bust. So I think that's the story. Scapa Flow was studied extensively. European fundings funded a lot of the research that I was involved in. All the modelling was done. The industry was interested in doing it. It would save a lot of problems for the container shipping industry and provide a new industry for Orkney. But the opportunity was kind of lost. It could be resurrected, but that would require political leadership and commitment. And that's really me. Thank you very much.
That's all very interesting. I noticed you indicated that that these were generally free ports, and that's sort of a topic at the moment, is the idea of free ports in Scotland. There's supposed to be money available for 2 of them, and that they're to be called Greenports. I wonder if you could tell us something about how that works and what the advantages are to the neighbourhood.
Yeah, well, I think the Scottish Government misunderstands free ports in the sense that free ports have been around a long time. The benefit I see for free ports is where you have linked the free port to the creation of an entirely new port. So the new port here, for example, could be developed as a free port. I think what's happening just now is the UK government has decided only 2 free ports will be provided in Scotland, and they will be given a pile of money each, which I think is 52 million between them. And the Scottish government has said they have to be green free ports. Now, by that, I think they mean that these 2 free ports will be linked to the facilities that supply the offshore wind lease arrangements that have recently been leased. So I think that's what they will be. They'll not be general cargo ports. They'll be ports that supply the offshore wind farms. and that might well be the fourth. It might well be Cromarty. It could be Orkney. So, but I think it misses the point about free ports globally are about general cargo, especially container ports. It's about developing general cargo, about improving the logistics for general cargo, and using the ports as a platform for multinational companies to do a lot of the added value logistics within the port, which can be done, and that enhances things for them. So I think we government really have misunderstood what free ports are about, and then confused it again by calling them green ports.
Thank you. That was really interesting, Al. Now, people who maybe don't know Scapa Flow as well as we in Orkney do, maybe don't realise that not only is it a deep anchorage, it's also incredibly sheltered. And therefore, I wonder if you could expand on the issue of pollution. And I'm thinking of that not only maybe even accidental spillage from ships, but noise pollution. If you were to have a container hub there with many feeder ships as well coming in, that's a huge increase on the number of vessels coming into that area, you know, adding on to what's already there. And what would be the effect, given that's a marine protected area, on wildlife, on both those aspects of pollution and on fishing, because there's incredible shellfish comes from Scapa Flow as well, a traditional industry that's world renowned. So I wondered, could you expand please on that issue? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. Yeah, I think you're right. The sheltered and deep water is a fantastic attribute. Scapa Flow is one of the world's finest natural harbours. That itself reduces vastly reduces the likelihood of accidents and problems, because you have to say that the estuaries of the North Continent and also the Thames and the Haven in the UK are not the best places in the world to put the biggest container ships in the world. You know, you've got the biggest container ships in the world at the moment going past people's back gardens up the Elbe Chaussee in Hamburg. It's absolutely crazy. And then they have to do the same 100-kilometer trip back out. So it's actually quite hazardous the way things are done at the moment. And this is where I think global shipping lines are beginning to understand that they need to reduce these risks quite a bit. I think the benefit we have in Orkney is we have a port authority that's extremely experienced in handling the very biggest ships in the world, and oil tankers, never mind container ships, to boot. So they have this expertise, and also safety and environmental aspects, anti-pollution aspects are things they're very strong on. So I think that they have the ability to do all this, and the previous directors of harbours have always supported the idea of handling container shipping as being another aspect of the virtues of Scapa Flow's natural advantages. Noise, yeah, there's always going to be noise from shipping activities, but there was a container ship in Kirkwall for many years, albeit a wee one, with streamlined. But yeah, port activity can be noisy to some extent, but I'm not so sure these things are actually happening in urban areas as we speak. You know, with the container terminals in many port cities work in harmony with local communities. There are noise dampening systems that can be used. But it depends on, at the end of the day, whether you think having a big port is important for your economy, your national economy, or whether it's not. These are political decisions, and up until now, the politicians have not supported this project in the UK. So that's why it's not gone ahead. But I don't think it's because of noise necessarily. I think there are other reasons why within the UK transport policy context, we have to remember that Scotland exists within that UK transport policy context. And although ports might seem the responsibility of Holyrood, they are not in terms of international trade. So, and port laws tend to be Westminster's domain. Port authorities were created by Acts of Parliament from Westminster. So Port Authority jurisdictions, roles and responsibility is actually reserved power. Transport, what I've found in terms of transport policy is in ports, there's definitely a bias towards the south of England. And port developments in the south of England have been largely promoted and indeed financed by the Treasury. If you look at dredging on the Thames for London Gateway, DP World's new port, dredging on Liverpool 2 container port development, these are projects that the UK ministries have pushed, but they have opposed port developments in Scotland, that ones that I've been involved in and I know quite a bit about. Even where European funding was available for them, and I mentioned that European funding was available for the Scapa Flow Port project back in 2008, 9, 10, but these proposals were not supported by the UK government. So UK civil servants were opposed to these projects. And that's in line with UK transport policy, which seems to be don't develop Scottish ports for whatever reason. And that might be another reason for, of course, more autonomy for Scotland.
Is that okay, Fiona? You want to come back?
Well, my noise pollution was really related to marine wildlife.
Right. Yeah.
And also, if there, what would be the effect on the fishing that takes place in that whole area just now? There's a lot of people who rely on the fishing industry in Orkney, which feels it's under attack anyway at the moment. So could you maybe expand on that a wee bit?
Well, again, it's a case of balancing out the needs of all different users in terms of the marine estate, if you like. The marine environment has quite a number of users, whether it's sea farms, fishermen, and so on. But ports, I mean, I see ports as being quite vital for international trade and for economic development of countries and regions and nations. So that's at the end of the day, politicians have to think about that, and people as well. Do you want advanced seaports to develop your economy or not? And if you don't, you won't get them. It's as simple as that. But in terms of noise pollution, I think container ports work in harmony with the marine environment globally. This is quite a modest port by comparison to some of the ports envisaged, and it actually reduces pressure on existing marine environments on the continent, particularly where they're having to develop not just container ports in many urban areas, but also dredge rivers for hundreds of kilometers from the North Sea, and the impact of that on the marine environment is enormous. When you're dredging entire rivers and maintain some of these rivers, remember, have a natural depth of maybe 4 or 5 meters. For example, the Elbe, the Scheldt, the Thames as well, they have a natural depth of just a few meters, and then they're dredging them down to 15, 16 meters to have an enormous channel over many, many kilometers. So the net impact of this compared to these is minor, but also has the ability to alleviate the pressure on much of the environment elsewhere.
More eggs iPad. I'm not sure that it's more egg, but if you'd like to come in.
Right, thanks indeed, Mike. No, it's Sandy Carmichael. I'm usually from Badenoch and Strathspey. It strikes me, listening to all of what you're saying, Alf, that the starting point for something like this is political will. Now that's political will of the people of Orkney, but I think there are waves extending out from that. It's political will beyond Orkney, the northeast around that area, Scotland as a whole, and as you say, Westminster with its control of transport policy and so on. But beyond political will, I think we need something in the way of a political champion. And that sounds as if what was something that was missing back in 2008, because often it does take one person, pushing doors and thumping tubs and so on to get things done. Now, if the Orkney Shetland MP would step up, that would be great. But there are plenty of people in the political classes who could mount something like this. Have you? I don't know whether you, Alf, have any observations on the source of that political champion. Are there any individuals that have stood out who strike you as being people who would move this on, or would be in a position to motivate and get something done such as this?
Thanks, Sandy. I'll come. There's quite a lot of good points here. The one of the issues that Highlands and Isles Enterprise were very enthusiastic about was the impact a container hub with international connections and global connections what that impact could do for the Highlands as a whole, particularly Caithness. And whether you could actually theorize perhaps a free trade zone within Caithness, feeding a container hub in Scapa Flow with simple cross Pentland Firth connections. So yeah, it could be a much wider impact, not just to Orkney, but to the north of Scotland, which badly needs something like this. On political will, at the time we had a very dynamic Director of Harbours for Scapa Flow, Captain Nigel Mills, who followed on from an equally dynamic Director of Harbours, Bob Moore. And Nigel Mills was extremely interested in the container hub and went out of his way to develop connections with container ports, with container lines, and with potential funding agencies. And we did a lot of work. Unfortunately, Captain Mills was in a very bad motorbike accident and died from it. And I think the momentum kind of went a wee bit with that. And he was the champion for it, I think, at the time. And we also had a council at the time that was very keen on it, but as I have to say, renewables entered the frame at the time, round about 2008-9, as renewables became the new kid on the block, the container hub was pushed aside. And I mentioned that the money that we had allocated from the public sector to recruit a team to develop the container hub, including people from Maersk Sealand, the container line and the container terminal company, to develop the infrastructure, these people weren't recruited. Instead, the council and other agencies here recruited people on renewables. And then they focused their attention on Pelamis, the Pelamis testing exercise, which was basically a research project rather than a business project, but went pretty badly overall. And that's what they used Scapa Flow for, the Scapa Flow site for, Lyness site. So the council kind of took a different approach after Captain Mills was no longer pushing the thing. So I think you're right, political will and a political champion is needed. Unfortunately, I don't see anybody in the council or the Scottish government that can take that up. The momentum was all pushed towards renewables, and here with EMEC as well. And it moved away from the container port project, which was very close to fruition.
Right. Okay, is that okay, Sandy? Yep, you're right. Well, we'll move on to Edward now, and then Ian after that.
Good evening. Can I have two questions?
Yes, there's not a big queue.
Not a big queue. Okay, the first one is I was reading an article about freeports, and a lot of them have become highly secretive storage places for some of the world's most valuable art, and have had valuable possessions which are kept out the view, out of sight of tax authorities for years on end. What help can be done if we made a Freeport, Shetland or Orkney?
Yeah. Is that two questions, Edward, or one?
The second one was you were talking earlier about European funding. Surely Brexit's put an end to that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, just quickly on the EU funding, a lot of the work that was done on the Scapa Flow project was related to European transnational projects that I was involved in, and the Harbours Department, and also Highlands and Islands Enterprise and Shetland Council and others were involved in. Yeah, you're right, that money's no longer there. But at the time, this was 2008 to 10, you know, so the money was there. But Britain, then the UK government was still not supportive, even although we were part of the EU and could access these funds. They didn't want us to access these funds because partly they had to match it. They were expected to match the funding. And plus they had this ideology in the UK that everything should be done by the market alone. In port sense, that's quite an immature approach, because the major ports are never created by the market acting alone. Because of the lumpy nature of seaports, the very long-term nature of the payback, and the social economic benefits and environmental benefits as well, and strategic benefits even militarily, ports are never provided by the market. They're always provided by public bodies, also in cooperation with private actors. And that's why we have the port concession model, which is typical in Europe. So ideologically, the UK government has a strange approach to ports. On the second thing about free ports, I don't see Freeport as being a critical aspect of this port. It could be an interesting add-on. I don't know anything about art treasures, unfortunately. I've got a few paintings of ferries, but I wouldn't say they're art treasures. But yeah, I think free ports are an interesting aspect. In terms of container port development, it's really just about growing the volumes. And this is important for a transshipment port, because a transshipment port doesn't have any local volumes. If you're looking at Freeport, Bahamas, or some of these other hubs, it's 99% transshipment. Salalah and so on. Even Singapore, I think, is 95%, and they've got 5 million people. But it's mostly transshipment. So what it's about is really creating a local demand for the port, whatever it is. But yeah, I agree. There's probably interesting practices that go on in some free ports around the world that you would want to try and avoid.
Okay, Edward.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right, Ian.
Sorry, I was just trying to get the mute to go off. I'm on a simple. Hiya. Oh, we've met 2 or 3 times. I've always found conversations with you very interesting, and tonight is no exception. Thanks very much.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Alf, I'd really like, you can imagine that a lot of us here are political. And what I'd really was like to know is that if we got together and discussed this for the Highlands and Islands, and we thought this should have happened, or it should still happen, I was wondering if there is any possibility you could have identified people who we should approach or we should speak to. You know, if, you know, is there another Nigel Mills out there somewhere that we could speak to? Is there, and, you know, and other prominent people who would be known quite well in the Highlands and Islands and might be persuaded to speak up for this on behalf of the Highlands and Islands, at least to start with, to see if we could grow that momentum. But similarly, who would be the most implacable opposition? And whether it comes from the UK government or it might come from other parts of Scotland. I just wondered. And I suppose in amongst that, are there any people in a global sense that would be interested in speaking to us. I often put a lot of emphasis when I'm campaigning on the fact that Scotland is not a small country in international terms. It's a medium-sized country. And if you start to look at a whole variety of other countries, some of them don't have a population the size of Orkney, let alone the Highlands and Islands. And I just wondered if there was examples of these smaller countries doing something like this, which is very ambitious and reaping the benefits. So I suppose I'm asking 3 questions in one. So I apologize to you and the audience, but if you can help at all, that would be brilliant. Even just pointing us in the direction of who to speak to would be brilliant, because often I don't know where to start with a discussion around certain topics.
Well, I have to say that this relates also to what we might call Scottish maritime policy, if it existed. And such a policy was written by Roy Peterson and myself a couple of years ago. You'll probably remember Roy Peterson was head of transport for Highlands Enterprise and a transport convener at Highlands Council after that. But he and I were commissioned by the SNP Westminster Group to write a maritime policy for Scotland about 3 or 4 years ago. And we did that. And Scapa Flow was part of that policy, was to create a transshipment hub within Scotland as part of national maritime policy. And as I explained, it's quite easy to do. If a national government wants to do something, it just advertises to the wider market it wants to do it, and it can then lease it out. But it requires political will. And what happened with our policy document as well? It was submitted to SNP National Conference. I think the last conference where people attended was 2019, and it was passed by conference to be implemented as SNP policy, which included the Scapa Flow project as an international container hub. But the SNP government has not done it. It's refused to implement that policy, as it's apparently refused to implement quite a few policies that conference passed. So that's one of the problems we have. My suspicion is the barrier is civil servants. The barrier is civil servants in Edinburgh, and I know this in other areas of policy, which I've encountered, and who follow the London line. And I mentioned before the London line on non-intervention in ports, not using the European concession model, not applying for EU funding at the time. So these are all part and parcel of UK policy. But essentially the SNP have had the green light from the members to push forward with Scapa Flow as a maritime policy that was written for the Westminster Group and also passed by National Conference, but they've refused to do that. So at that level in the SNP, we don't have support for this for some reason. ALBA is a different matter. ALBA support this project. Kenny McCaskill supports this project. He would be supportive of it. So I think, I would assume then Alex Salmon would be supportive of it. But, so it's not a big project. In global port terms, this is quite a small project. It's not much different in size from the Aberdeen project in terms of money. And Aberdeen, as you know, well, Aberdeen is a £300 million investment, but it's mostly public money. But it's not for a container port. It's really just for an offshore port, an offshore to handle the offshore oil and gas supply vessels, as well as wind farm developments coming up. But it shows you that government and politicians have power to develop big port projects like Aberdeen, which is what they call a trust port, but it's basically a private port in all respects in that sense, without necessarily shareholders. So I think, yeah, the political will depends on who we're talking about, and the SNP don't seem to have the political will to do something like this, and don't seem to have the strength to address the let's face it, the British civil servants in Holyrood in Victoria Quay are running the policy for Scotland on transport like ports. So they're opposed to this development, and really any serious development that doesn't quite fit the political imperative. Aside from that, I don't know locally what who or what would support this project anymore. There's been changes in the Port Authority, as you know, at the highest level twice since Captain Mills left. None of them seem to have an awareness of maybe container shipping. Captain Mills at least had some knowledge of that and the wider international shipping market, and he could see the opportunity that was available. So I'm not sure whether that answers your question, Ian, but I think it's still an opportunity there. But essentially, the SNP government kind of let it down a bit. Of course, previous to that, Fergus Ewing was instrumental in Pelamis at Lyness and pushing the agenda away from the container port at the time with EMIC. And I think EMIC also, I don't know if anybody from EMIC is here tonight, but EMIC also had a strong role in that as well, in directing resources towards renewables away from a container port project, which, as I say, could have put Scotland on the global trade map and also doubled trade virtually with quite a small facility, really.
That's very interesting. Thanks very much. I would invite all of us to be thinking of this with the local elections coming along. And particularly if there was a problem with the SNP not pushing something or the Greens being obstructive. Something like this affects us all. So maybe at a future meeting, we could look at subjects like this and think, what should we do? What should we be doing in terms of canvassing the opinion of candidates?
Well, you also mentioned, Ian, that what do others, well, we won't say small countries do, but I've been following the container port developments across many countries, and particularly former colonies. And if you look at former colonies of the UK and other imperial powers, one of the first things they do on independence is develop their seaport infrastructure, whether that's Singapore, Dubai, Colombo, Oman, Malta, all these places, and also French North Africa, Egypt, and so on. All these countries quite quickly develop their ports and trade because what they find at the point of decolonization is their infrastructure is underdeveloped. And I think that's where Scotland has to look. When I compare, I mean, I've studied ports globally for more years than I care to remember and visited most of them as well and worked on joint research projects with many of them. And I come back to Scotland and what I see is an underdeveloped nation, seaport-wise. On the Central Belt, we've had no new port projects really since Victorian times. No serious new ports. So, and in that time, of course, shipping has been transformed, whether it's container shipping, ferries, cruise ships. What Orkney's been able to do has been develop projects like Hatston, which the rest of Scotland really can only look and wonder, because Hatston is the best cruise ship ferry terminal in Scotland by far. And I was trying to develop something similar on the Forth with interest groups around Cockenzie, Preston Pans, and we've got heckish barriers to overcome there as well. Trying to develop a new port on the Forth. And even going back to the 70s, early 80s, when I worked in shipping in Leith as a ship agent and shipping clerk, we were calling for more new port infrastructure then in the 70s, and we never got it. And essentially Scotland's, so going back to this thesis about decolonization, when your country is more or less treated as a colonial appendage, you're there to basically supply the core nation. You're not there to develop your international trade and your global connections. In fact, you're prevented from doing so. And that's Scotland's legacy at the moment. Scotland is not operated as a country entity, really. It's still in that phase of decolonization, if you like. But the point I'm making is that all these previous territories, previous colonial territories, the first thing they did was develop their seaports and trade. Because without seaports, you can't develop your trade and your economy. And that's the first thing they do. Every single one of them.
Well, that's fascinating. thank you very much. You've given me ammunition to mull over. I'll maybe come back to you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, Peter.
Hi,
Yeah.
thank you, and thanks very much indeed, Alf, for this talk. It's extremely interesting. My question is, if Orkney doesn't, for whatever reason, good or bad, doesn't go for this, what would be the second best site that could come in as a competitor? Thinking anything from Shetland to down the east coast, down the west coast to Ireland. Are there any competitive sites at all?
Yeah, well, when I was working on this project, one of the Icelandic Foreign Ministry organized a conference quite quickly on container transshipment, and they were working on that. The Norwegians were working on something similar, and the Russians too, but that was mainly for Trans-Arctic stuff that they were moving through on the Northern Sea route increasingly. And that is regarded as a future potential route for container shipping. The ice-free season has extended, and the icebreakers introduced are much more efficient and can operate longer in the season. And that is an opportunity as well. But the Icelandics were very, very busy in trying to think about developing a mid-Atlantic load center, as they do for aviation at Keflavik. They do exactly the same thing with a big mainline aircraft coming in from Philadelphia and Halifax and other places coming into Keflavik and then transshipping people onto European connections. They've been doing that for decades. Same thing. I also worked on a project at Hunterston with Clydeport before they were acquired by Peel. And Peel ports, well, to cut a long story short, Hunterston, Clydeport were wanting to create a container port also at Hunterston, at the Ore port, which has a natural deep water location and very good navigation around the wee island there. And it's close to the Atlantic too. Not the same situation as Scapa Flow, but equally able to do it. And that project was also dropped when Clydeport were acquired by Liverpool, by Peel Ports. And what Liverpool did, Peel Ports, is they then progressed Liverpool to container terminal and got Treasury money to do the dredging there. So you can see a kind of competitive situation developing between English ports and Scottish ports, and where the English port is owning the Scottish port. And we see this the same in Tilbury owning the Forth. Forth ports are actually pretty much mostly Tilbury. So they don't have any problems with developing a new ferry and cruise port down at Tilbury on the site of the old power station there, but they won't do that at Cockenzie, which is an opportunity waiting to happen as well. So what we see is a constraint across Scotland in terms of port opportunities. They're just not happening because of the power base being south of the border, as it were. On container transshipment, the main factor is a large area of flat land. And I'm not sure Shetland's Vos fit in with that very well. It's also a bit further north off the main Pentland Firth Channel. The biggest attribute here is the zero deviation of the big ships. So this is what the virtue of container transshipment globally, whether it's Freeport, Bahamas, Malta, Suez, Colombo, Singapore, and Malacca, it's all the same. It's just zero deviation. And this is where Scapa Flow has a big advantage, as well as having a big brownfield site, natural deep water, and plenty land, plenty flat land able to do this. The other thing about a container transshipment terminal is it's half the price or less of a normal container terminal, in that you're only producing the terminal for ship to ship. You don't have rail access, you don't have road access, you don't have all these additional expenses. So it's much, much cheaper. But essentially, I suppose what I'm saying is if we don't do it, somebody else will do it. And certainly the Irish had interests in doing something similar, and the Icelandics.
Where in Ireland would be suitable? What kind of?
Well, the big oil terminal, I think on the west coast at Bantry Bay at Shannon as well. There's sites there, and there's massive fishing industry there, as you probably know, as well down at Beer Island, or is it Beer Island, and other areas. There's quite a lot of there's a massive amount of fishing activity going on too. And Ireland is a very dynamic economy. Yeah, I was in touch with people in the Irish Marine Institute about this, because some of them came from container shipping, and they're very proactive. And as you know, they're developing a lot of direct Irish continent connections, particularly for ferries. And that's part of their national policy, which we don't have in Scotland. We, they've been developing post-Brexit 20 or 30 weekly services to the continent. We've been doing nothing. We still depend on all our goods going down through English ports. Which shows you the inactivity of the Scottish government really on this matter. They don't seem to have any interest. But I think as I said before, I go back to the civil service is not doesn't seem committed to developing Scotland as a whole. Scotland still has a role just mainly to serve the core UK market. Largely, its international trade is not prioritised. Or its international trade facilitation and development is not prioritized. And it won't be until we develop seaports, because you need seaports to develop your trade. And at the moment, we're just playing a losing game.
Right, thanks very much.
Okay, Brenda?
Yeah, I've got a very quick question. Is the idea of having a container port and having renewables mutually exclusive? Do you need some separation?
Well, I've actually always believed they're complementary, very complementary, especially in terms of supplying. The container port is a big energy consumer. If you like, with container cranes, with cranes on the quayside, with other handling equipment, lighting and so on, and also supplying power to the ships. So it's easily complementary in that sense. It shouldn't be competitive. There was no real need, in my view, to give away the entire Lyness terminal just to one Palamas wave machine. That seemed nonsensical to me. But I think the loss of a dynamic director of harbours was a factor there, and that allowed other interests just to prioritise their own agenda. So what we had was a renewables lobby that was very much focused only on itself. That's the other thing here. It wasn't an either or, but to me, they're very complementary. In fact, a container port could have been used to import and export a lot of goods related to renewables around Europe, not just for here, because there's a massive amount of logistics involved in renewables and wind farms, especially the floating wind farms now as well. So there's a lot of that could have been handled at Scapa Flow. So I saw a lot of complementarity, but what I think we also saw was the vested interests in the renewable industry just doing their own thing and disregarding the container project. It should have been a win-win for everybody. On employment, that was another big issue, and the employment impact of a container terminal was studied by Mr. Blackadder, I think, in Shetland, and his colleagues who do environmental economic impact studies. And yeah, a first phase of a container terminal, you're talking about direct jobs of more than 250 and possibly indirect and induced employment, taking it to 1,000 in total, which for Orkney is enormous. So it was seen as by Harbours Department as a potential replacement for the Flotta oil terminal should that ever close, for example. It would provide a comparable amount of jobs or more, 1,000 jobs in a phase one with direct and indirect, which is very important for a place like Orkney, which at the moment depends very much on public sector jobs as well as seasonal tourism and other aspects. So it would provide quite a strong diversification to the economy as a whole. And long term, that would be strengthened, I'm quite sure. But yeah, it's complementary. It's complementary. It should be to renewables and to provide a green port, a green sustainable port. That's what really the objective was.
Thank you.
Anybody else with a burning question? I'm sort of summarising some of the things that I've heard you say there, that, and I maybe phrase it in a question: is how would you see this changing in an independent Scotland?
Well, I think the culture in an independent Scotland would change markedly, in that the country would then have to look after itself, its own interests, and prioritise aspects like this. So the way to improve the economy is probably the key to your future competitiveness as a nation. And there's nothing that, I don't think there's much that improves your competitiveness than global connectivity. If you can provide global and cheap connectivity, as cheap as possible, and container shipping up until recently has been a very cheap transport mode. And that's what's grown global trade. Container shipping was one of the critical enablers of globalization, which some green people might regard as not so positive. But the fact is that around the world, globalization has had quite a significant positive impact as well, creating employment in places which didn't exist before. So I think it is absolutely essential to develop major infrastructure like this. And it's not just, I think it's not just seaports. Our infrastructure as a whole is lacking behind. The UK itself is, as Michael Porter even 30 years ago was saying, was in the decline phase industrially, but its infrastructure was weak. And we see even our infrastructure in terms of energy collapsing over the winter. And some say, but our infrastructure in general is poor, and we've not prioritized it. And we have this, what I would say is a kind of colonial legacy, where our priorities are driven by pretty much London policy on ports, on aviation, on trade, on energy, on offshore energy, on everything. We're not getting the benefit of these resources, as you know, whether it's oil and gas or renewables. We don't actually get the benefits, the financial benefits of all these exports as well. So we don't get the earnings and the benefit from that. So you're left with an underdeveloped economy. And that's what we have. And advanced seaports are just part and parcel of upscaling. I did some work many moons ago with the World Bank, and the World Bank was well known for going into, not perfect, but it was well known for going into underdeveloped countries. The first thing they did was develop the ports. Finance the ports, because without decent seaports and getting rid of all the Spanish practices and corruption and everything as well, then trade is hindered, trade is held back, the economic growth is held back. So even Fraser of Allender said the only thing that will grow our economy is if we improve our trade, and they mean improve it dramatically, because our trade is moribund, our trade is very limited. Our trade is very oriented towards England. And this is the position Ireland found itself in even until about 30, 40 years ago. Its trade was dominated by England, one buyer, one supplier. And therefore, not really a competitive situation. But Ireland's been able to move ahead now and move towards, I think, more than 70% of its trade might be with Europe now, or with other markets than England. Where Scotland's still locked into this supply chain position with one core nation in a kind of colonial nature. That's where your trading relationship is dominated by, which is not a healthy position. So independence is really necessary to think anew, to think like an independent nation, and to develop global connectivity as well, which is a cultural thing too, internationalization. It enables, when I started in shipping, we actually still had shipping connections with Norwegian ports, Danish ports, German, Dutch, Portuguese, French. So we had these ships coming in every week, and this gave you very strong cultural connections with these areas, linguistic and other aspects as well. So it just changes your outlook, becomes very internationalized. Whereas Scotland, in a sense, is in a pretty difficult situation because of its politics.
Interesting that you said that about the one supplier, one customer, and it's an argument of the better together that we can't separate from the UK because we depend upon the English market.
Well, yeah, better together used to say, well, we sell most of our goods to England, but actually when I looked at the logistics retail index, it seemed that we were buying twice as much from them.
Right.
You know, we're maybe selling, I think it was at the time about 60 billion a year, but we're actually importing more than 100 billion in logistics in retail. And all our retail comes up the M6. All our retail comes up the West Coast Mainline or the M6, and it comes in through Tesco and everything else, and Currys and all the rest of it. So that's where all our spend goes, rather than bringing in goods from globally direct to Scotland, which might transform things, change things, also improve the economy and improve competitiveness if we're buying goods at lower prices as well. You know, even energy, we're buying energy back, which is produced here, but buying it at high prices. And this is the colonial reality, is that you end up selling your goods cheaply because you have no control over them, really. And even whiskey, for example, we seldom have real control over it all. And then you're buying back goods at higher prices. So we have the worst of all worlds here. But that's a colonial reality. That's what all colonial territories had to put up with, and that's what made them problematic economies as well.
And yet Scotland used to have direct trade links with the Low Countries, Belgium, France, etc. We were much more of an international country then.
And the Baltics.
Well, that's right, Ian. I was ship agent in Leith. I mentioned that when I started there, I used to run a container service every 4 days to Rotterdam. And we were also agents for Royal Netherlands Steamship Company services to the Caribbean and South America. But we were, like many companies, taken over by London companies. Robin McAlpine's written a lot about this recently, about Scotland's takeovers. a lot of Scottish companies, all sectors really, have been acquired by London companies, and then a lot of them are then shut down and their activities transferred. So that's what happened in shipping for us. And eventually, any goods that were left were simply sent by truck to Dover, which is not the best option, really.
No. It's hard to get it from London to Dover, never mind anywhere.
Well, that's right. I remember the company that acquired our company saying to me in their office in London that we shouldn't be agents for the Dutch shipping, the national shipping line of Holland anyway. I said, well, why is that? He says, well, you're just a sub-nation, so you should be a sub-agent. And that was his rationale. He wanted to be agent for the whole of Britain and Ireland, and because we were a sub nation, we should be a sub agent, and that was the terminology back in the 70s. I was flabbergasted, of course, but that's the way things pan out.
At least they called us a nation.
Sub-nation.
Yeah. When you say McAlpine's written, has he written anything substantial, a book, or what, or was he just a load of articles?
It's mainly articles, but some very probing articles in the recent months since the turn of the year. That's on Robin McAlpine's own blog.
Right.
And that's very interesting as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Good.
So have we got any other questions, Ralph? Yes. Sandy. You've muted.
Yep, trying to find the button. Thank you. Thanks. I think this has been fascinating. It's opened my eyes in a big way. And I tell you what has just opened my eyes even further in astonishment. Fiona Graham has very helpfully put up in the chat. I'll give you a moment to find it. have a look at what she's put up there from the Orkney Islands Council's Harbours Master Plan.
Master plan,
Now,
yeah.
Lyness gets about 5 sentences in here, and that to me contrasts with the absolutely enormous opportunity that you've described here, Alf. And the few sentences that this master plan gives to Lyness seems to dismiss the opportunities as, you know, as if they're small retail shops in comparison to your, you know, Harrods of an opportunity, if I could put it that way.
Yeah.
Just looking at that, well, however briefly I did. Did you have any involvement in that? Do you know of any future developments on that master plan?
Yeah, when I saw the outline of the master plan, it just seemed it's focusing on, I think, the offshore wind energy opportunities for a small scale new port facility over the east side of Scapa Flow towards Scapa Bay, to quite near the harbour's pier, and also I think that was on the argument that it might be involved in decommissioning oil rigs and stuff like that, which is the fashion of the month for many ports. They want to get involved in things like offshore wind or renewables, and offshore wind and decommissioning. But I think the big opportunity here has been the container port, but the new management maybe running the harbours department don't know much about that. And the company that does the master plans for Scottish ports, I think it's still a consultant called Fisher, and they just use the same framework everywhere they go, creating a nice little master plan. It's all about the port owner, whoever owns it, whether it's a trust or a council, trying to access some money from central government for its projects. And that's basically what it's about. But it's obviously they don't envisage anything on container transshipment. But you'd have to ask them why they've ignored it. There's plenty of stuff out there in the records in the Harbours Department on the work that was done. Enormous amount of work done on the container port project, enormous amount of research and marketing as well. And really the container shipping industry, the ones that people that I still speak to say, you know, what's happening in Scapa? and really the answer is not very much. Because remember the container lines, quite often when you tell them about a new port, the two things they ask you is, when's it opening and how much does it cost? Because they expect public port authorities to push these things themselves, national governments to push these things. That's who push big, major, lumpy port and capital investment projects like this that benefit the national economy. It has to depend on the national government. A shipping company won't come along and do it all itself. That's not what they do. They respond to national governments. This has to be part of national policy. It has to be part of a national strategy to develop a major port like this that serves the whole nation, but also third nations as well. A transshipment hub really serving 30 or 40 countries. In fact, we got more interest from the Germans, believe it or not, from German investors and other investors, Maltese and so on, even I have to say Russian, in this project than we got from the UK.
I wondered if perhaps this is something that we should be pushing here in the council elections, or asking people what their attitude to it is and maybe just raising awareness.
Yeah.
But if it's got to be a national decision to do it, but it would still require local participation to push for it, wouldn't it?
Yeah. I mean, when we were studying this, I do remember the Harbours Department speaking to some, they had public meetings on Hoy to do with this. They went through pretty much a lot of the environmental process that they have to go through before planning this project. This was very close to planning approval in that sense. And so they went through the initial stages of the planning process with the local community. And they even went to the extent of talking about even compensation for anyone that might have to move away from the terminal site itself. There's not many houses around Lyness, but there are some. So there was quite a varied discussion at the time and public meetings on Hoy. And it generally seemed to be quite positive, I have to say. There didn't seem to be any real showstoppers on it. As I say, I think the main problem was just the change in focus of the council towards renewables. That was also flavour of the month of the Scottish Government at the time, come 2008, 9, 10. And even I have to say Alex Salmond and the future of Scotland was renewables. And that's where all the focus went. And they just kind of parked the idea of a container hub or just put it aside.
Right, well, I see that time is getting on, just about 10 to 9 there. If we've exhausted the topic now, if anybody's got any other questions, then raise your hands and we'll see if we can answer them. Otherwise, we just remain to thanks very much, Alf, for your interesting presentation. It's fascinating to see the opportunity that's been missed and hope we can maybe catch up on it again.
Yep. Thank you, Mike, and thanks for all the questions, everybody.